Hello again, everyone. Sorry for the strange background. They're actually paving my neighborhood, so I'm kind of hiding in the quietest spot I could find. Hopefully quiet. So today I wanted to talk about something that I am increasingly seeing more and more of. And this is not something I actually used to run into, 10, 20, 30 years ago. But recently, in the last several years, last maybe 5 years, I am seeing more and more people who are arguing that the good folk from Ireland or Scotland or Wales only exist in those places, can only be found in those places, and that they don't exist, cannot be found anywhere else. And there's a lot of layers to this. So I do want to say just right up front that the ultimate answer here is yes, no, and maybe. It's complicated, like anything else to do with this subject. But what I'm seeing when people are talking about it is a real lack of nuance. It's just a flat no. If you want to connect to the Irish good folk, you have to go to Ireland, and not just to Ireland, but to the specific the specific fairy hills or specific locations associated with them, and etc. So multiple layers going on here. And I will also say up front, I am actually in the process of writing a book on this subject, Celtic Fairies in North America specifically. So I do have some bias, clearly, on the subject. Also, it is a subject that's worth a full book, so in a video I'm only going to be able to kind of touch on the highlights. Now, getting into the yes portion first. Yes, there are certain types of the good folk who are very strongly associated or connected to specific physical locations in the human world. If you want to connect to a particular being that is associated with a particular place, that has folklore and stories connected to that particular place, then your best bet is, if possible, to go to that particular place. That makes sense. And that is, in fact, how that works. If you want to connect to, a being who is known to appear in a certain location, then that's where you're most likely to encounter that being. So that part is straightforward. And I do think this is where maybe some of this confusion is coming in. This idea that they are associated with specific locations, which they are, and they can be connected to particular geography, which they can be. But that's not the entirety of the subject, and that's not everything. Again, that's taking out all the nuance to this. So there are also stories, and there's at least one Irish one that I know of people who have fled the country or fled the area, fled across the ocean to escape from or get away from either a particular being or a particular group of the other crowd. And that was successful, that they basically could never return to their original home, but that they had gotten away from the good folk who were upset with them. And normally this is a case where the person has offended those particular beings, that they have some sort of supernatural punishment coming towards them, and so they get on a boat and flee, go across the ocean, get away. And that works, and then they are never able to return. And some people look at that and draw the conclusion from that it must mean that the good folk cannot cross the ocean, and that is how the person is able to get away. Again, this is taking all of the nuance out of this conversation. If you look just at that one example, that one story or type of story, then that is a logical conclusion to draw. However, this is where the no portion of the answer comes in. We also have stories, there's a particular Scottish one that I'm thinking of people who were trying to get away from members of the good folk, who left, who again fled across the ocean. In this case, I believe it was to Canada, might have been the United States. But either way, fled across the ocean in order to escape this particular being, and it did not work. And then they were writing home about how it had failed. In this case, it was a Lonanshi, a fairy lover, that the gentleman could not continue dealing with. She was too much for him, basically. So he had tried to leave, left Scotland, gone across the ocean, and it did not work. She did in fact follow him. He wrote to his family that the spirit was still with him, that he had not been able to escape. So when we look at that story, that seems to very clearly directly contradict the idea that the good folk can't go wherever they choose to go, that they are regionally or geographically bound. And we do have other material that's similar to this. If we look across the folklore, the history of the folklore, we have material going back to at least the 18th century that I found of people in the United States and in Canada, both places, talking about beings from Ireland, Scotland, Wales, who had followed communities, and some cases individual families, but usually it followed communities. So where you have a diasporic community, where you have a group of Irish or Scottish or Welsh, etc., people who have immigrated and formed a new community in a new place, you have this idea that these spirits come and follow people. And this is something that is very common, I think, in diasporic communities. If you are someone who is living in like the Irish diaspora, and in this case I'm specifically referring to the community that's formed by people within 1 or 2 generations of having left Ireland, sort of that living diasporic community. If you're part of that culture, which is something that I've been connected to for many years, then it's always just sort of assumed that these spirits, that these beings who, you know, had a connection to people in the original country, also can be found in the new country with these communities, with these people. There's a book by Quinn called, I believe it's Irish American Folklore in New England, which I highly recommend. It does have a chapter talking about, in part, beliefs about the fairies, the good folk, in these communities, and the way that people just sort of assumed that their spirits went where they went. Now, this opens up a wider discussion where some people feel like this is not a case of the spirits actually following people in communities. This is people in communities misidentifying indigenous spirits. I personally tend to disagree with that. I will put it out there, like, this is a thing people say, you know, it has its valid points, and in some cases I do think it probably does happen this way. But in a lot of cases, the indigenous spirits in various areas of North America are very different in how they would actually interact with or appear to people. And the stories we have of them, although we can draw broad similarities, there are many things about indigenous North American spirits that are roughly analogous or similar to the Celtic language speaking countries' fairy beliefs, but they're not identical. You know, there's variation, there's differences, and I really don't think that people coming from Ireland, for example, would misidentify a being as a member of the Aishi who was pretty clearly like one of the Inuit Sindhi or the Nunahe or the Makiwisug. They're just not similar enough, I think, for that sort of misidentification to happen. I think instead what we get is a sort of blending or mixing of beliefs in places where we have these sort of layered things going on, and colonialism, of course. So that needs to be considered. There's also an idea that you will see people suggesting that, in fact, these spirits exist globally, and that different cultures just have different names for them, but they're basically all the same sorts of beings. They're all like the identical kind of being in different places, just called different things. I also personally don't agree with that. I think that, again, is overly simplifying what's going on, but I'm putting out there as a thing people say. The final view, which I think is the theory that I favor more, and which I would encourage people to consider, is the idea that these spirits, these beliefs, are not so much attached literally, in most cases, to the geography, but they're attached culturally to the people, and the people are the culture. When people move, they take their culture with them. And yes, in a new place, it can evolve in new directions and grow in different ways. So, of course, the Irish American diaspora, the Canadian, Irish Canadian diaspora, Scottish Canadian diaspora is not the same as Ireland or Scotland would be. Those are not the same places. The cultures go in different directions, but nonetheless, the culture is the people, and people take their culture with them when they move from one place to another, and they take their beliefs, their folk beliefs with them when they move from one place to another. And this is actually something that we do see across history. So if you take Scotland, for example, Scotland was settled by the Dalriada Irish. The Scottish Gaelic language is actually from Old Irish. That is where it originates. That is why Scottish Gaelic and Irish Gaelic, I guess it's not what most people say these days, they just say Irish. But for this video, Irish Gaelic and Scottish Gaelic are very similar language, kind of like Spanish and Portuguese, because they share this one root with Old Irish because of the Dalriada settling in Scotland. And that community also brought many of these beliefs with them, which has clearly impacted the last 1,500 years of Scottish culture, which has also been impacted by Norse influence as well as English, particularly in the border areas. So culture is never a simple, straightforward thing. It's not monolithic. It is something that kind of changes and is influenced, and this includes the folk beliefs. So, for example, in Scotland, it was very common up until at least the 1950s, I think even into today, to use the term elf as the English equivalent term for the she, spelled different from the Irish, but pronounced the same, for the she. Whereas in Ireland, the term fairy is more commonly used for those same beings. It's a cultural influence thing. Germanic cultures tend to favor elf. English cultures, particularly coming from the French, tend to favor fairy. So areas with a stronger Norse influence later, more elf. Areas colonized by England, which I realize does apply to Scotland too, but who have a lot of English language influence, more fairy. Cultural terms. It's the way that culture moves around. Iceland is another great example. When Iceland was settled, the Norse who settled there, also the Irish, the Norse who settled there imported with them involuntarily, influenced those beliefs then. So we have this idea of the Alfar and the Huldafolk in Iceland. Obviously, those are not native Icelandic beliefs. The people who existed in Iceland, the indigenous Icelandic people, did not believe in the Norse Alfar and the Norse Huldafolk and all of that. That is something that the later settler colonial cultures brought with them. But it's become very intrinsic as a belief in those places. And I think that we just need to keep things like that in mind when we're trying to put these very rigid boundaries on these beings and these beliefs and these concepts. It really is difficult to reduce it down to we only find a she in this one particular place and they can't possibly be anywhere else. We have a lot of folklore that contradicts that. We have a lot of just anthropology and history that contradicts that idea. Up until fairly recently, when, like I said, I have started to see people really pushing this idea that you can only encounter these beings in these very specific places. And again, as I said at the beginning of the video, there's an aspect to that is true. This is where we get into the maybe part of the answer. There's an aspect of that is true. There are certain beings that are geographically very specific, who are very connected to not just, say, Irish folklore or Scottish folklore or Welsh folklore, but like this particular lake or that particular hill. And in those cases, you do need to probably consider, as my phone rings, sorry about that, you do need to probably consider actually going to those places if possible, in order to encounter those beings or interact with them if you wanted to. However, We also have a lot of stories of these beings traveling and moving around. We have stories of them connected to specific families. As I said, we have one story about a man who left, I believe it was Ireland, to escape the good folk because he'd angered them and succeeded. They did not follow him, but he could never return. And then that could be used to support this idea that no, they can't leave. On the other hand, we have the story of the man who had the Lananshi, who fled to get away from her and did not work, and she did follow him across the ocean, and he did not manage to get away at all. So this is just a very complicated subject. There is no simple answer, I don't think. And I think in a lot of cases, it's really going to come down to specifically what type of being we're talking about. So a lot of the kings and queens of fairy, for example, were once or are still gods and goddesses. They're connected to the Danan in some cases. They were understood to be deities historically. Now they're kings and queens of fairy. I would be very hesitant personally to put limits on those sorts of beings and what they can do and where they can go. If you want to connect to Finvara, obviously Nachma in Galway is going to be a good option because it's very strongly associated with him, but I don't think he is limited to that. And I think if we look at, for example, Scotland, where we have stories of Angus Mac and Och, we have stories of Briege, we have stories of the Cailleach, which are all pretty clearly rooted in the older Irish belief coming through from the Dalraida. I think that kind of shows that those sorts of beings can't really be geographically limited, that they go where these populations, where these communities go. They go where the belief in them goes. And I think the same can be said when we're talking about some other types of the good folk. The Sluishi, for example, is very well known to travel. And to travel across water and across the ocean. Another argument you will see is this idea that the good folk can't cross water. I think that the folklore about that is very complicated and very contradictory. We do have the idea of crossing water as a protection to escape them, but we also have many stories where they cross water. In Patricia Lysat's book, The Banshee, where she's talking specifically about Banshee myths, Banshee is not only a death omen, it doesn't only appear to warn people of a coming death, they also appear just as a being in folk stories. People can encounter them, usually involves a comb in some way, but I won't get into it. I'll do a separate video on Banshees at some point in the future. But there are stories that Patricia Lysat relays about a person who encountered a Banshee, really made the Banshee angry, stole something from her, and ran and jumped across a stream, and the Banshee followed him, crossed the stream, followed him to his house. So obviously in that case, the crossing water was not an effective protection, did not help him. You have beings, for example, like the Idriski, the water horses, the Kelpies. Water is not going to stop them, you know. I think there might be something to the argument that perhaps they won't cross water in some cases because they're territorial and the water marks the boundary area, perhaps. But I'm saying this mostly to say that when you hear these sort of strong arguments of no, the good folk can't go outside of Ireland or Scotland or Wales or wherever because they won't cross bodies of water, we have stories that support that and we have stories that contradict that. Both. When you hear these stories of like, no, they're tied to this very specific geography, they don't move around, but then we also have stories of, for example, the ferry raid in Scotland, where there's these grand processions on particularly Bealtaine and Samhain, where the good folk move from one particular hill, one particular ferry mound, to another across the human world landscape. And we have similar ideas kind of in Ireland. They're not referred to as ferry raids there, but this idea that they do move and they do travel from one fairy hill to another, from one sort of home to another at different times of year. So again, it's this contradictory material. Some stories, yes, they're very tied to one place. Other cases, no. They do move around. So ultimately, I think when we're talking about the idea of the Irish or Scottish, the Celtic language speaking fairy beings, the good folk, the Aishi, the Inishe, whatever we want to call them, I really don't think we can make blanket statements. For example, I don't think all of them would necessarily follow a community. Some of them might be very geographically bound, but I also don't think none of them can do that. I think it's much more complicated. I also think we need to be cautious in limiting these beings, and in seeing them in ways that really reduces them and their power, and to this idea that they are tied to like 3 square miles or whatever it is of territory, and they are not able to go outside of that or influence things outside of that or what have you. I would just be very cautious to go in that direction. I think that when we look at the entire body of the folk belief, it is complicated. I think we do need to look in this case at the historic material, at the older folk material, before we fall into this idea that no, they must be in this one particular location, because that really isn't what we see historically. There's also another factor here that has to be considered, which is cultural exchange. The idea that, cultures affect each other. Material and beliefs are interchanged between community groups that interact with each other. And that does impact this whole concept. If you have an Irish community that settles outside of Ireland, it's not like they check their culture at the shore and show up in the new place a blank slate. That is not how humans work. It's not how human culture works. People bring their beliefs with them. People bring the beings that they believe in with them. And then they encounter new beings and new beliefs and new concepts as they interact with other cultures and other groups in a new place, and things get incorporated and blended, which is why the diasporic communities aren't exactly like the original communities. But these are all factors that have to be considered in this wider conversation. Now, I will say, after having said all of that and kind of shown my hand a bit in which side of this all I support the most, that I do also think there is a lot of overgeneralization that has been happening. Not everything is the ace-she. If you are in the US, can you encounter the ace-she? Personally, I do believe you can. I believe we have hundreds of years of folklore that supports that. But I do not think that every single thing here is of the ace-she. There's a lot of indigenous belief. Indigenous belief is extremely rich and varied and regional, so it's going to depend a lot on exactly where you live, what is going on around you. We also run into the issue of modern beliefs, the evolution of belief, all of that kind of going on. And I see a lot of people talking about, feeling like they've encountered one of the ace-she, one of the good folk, Irish specific. Usually they'll just refer to them as the she. And then they'll describe something that is pretty clearly not one of the she, which isn't to say it wasn't a genuine experience or a genuine encounter, just that the label they're giving it, the term they're applying to it, isn't accurate. And these are not people who are Irish, who grew up with these folk beliefs and sort of moved to a new place. That's a separate conversation, which we were talking about earlier. These are people who are just searching for a term. And because the Irish, the she, has become kind of popular, I did warn you that they were paving, so there's a little bit of background noise right now. Because those terms have gotten very popular, people are latching on to the term she and then applying it to just anything supernatural. And I do think that is an issue. So we want to avoid overly generalizing. In the same way, I would also argue if you were in the US or in Canada and you encounter something that pretty clearly does seem to be one of the ace-she, or a puka, or a banshee experience, any of these things, that I would be really hesitant to attribute that to something indigenous, particularly if it does not line up with or sound like anything indigenous to that area. Because then you're starting to step into this overwriting of indigenous beliefs where you're creating something new, but using an indigenous term for it. And that is also a problem. I think it would be much better actually to call like a general supernatural thing by sort of an inappropriate, maybe European term, than to overwrite the indigenous folklore by taking a term from there and just using it for something random. If you don't have a strong understanding of all of these cultures involved, it's always okay to just say a supernatural being, a spirit, one of the other, capital O, other. There are terms you can use that are a little more generic that don't involve sort of insertion into existing folk beliefs in ways that might be overwriting or appropriating those folk beliefs. I think we need to be cautious of that. But that all said, getting back to the original question, are there Irish good folk? Are there Irish fairies outside of Ireland? I think yes. I think there's a pretty strong, good amount of evidence that supports the idea that people have always believed that those beings can be found outside of that particular geography. But as I said at the beginning, this is a complicated conversation, and just because they can be found outside of Ireland if they choose to be for whatever reason, does not mean that everything is that, or even that that is like the most likely thing for something to be. So, as I said at the very beginning, this is a complicated subject. I really encourage people to give this all a lot of deep thought and draw your own conclusions, of course, as always. But I encourage people not to really quickly jump into any simplified view in any direction with this subject. And of course, I am talking about this all in this video in very broad terms, but I do think that this is a nuanced conversation that if we're talking about a specific type of being, if we are talking about the Banshee, the Banshees, if we're talking about Puka, if we're talking about Ishiki, Selkies, what have you, a specific type of being, then that changes the conversation slightly, because each of those beings has their own folklore, and each of those beings, there are different ideas about whether they can or cannot go into different places. I mentioned Selkies. Selkies as an otherworldly sort of being fall into this very wide grouping. Folklore about them is already found in a huge range of places, from Scotland and Ireland to the Orkneys to Iceland. I'm sure there's more that I'm forgetting offhand, but this is already a folk belief that's very diverse and found in a lot of different cultures, quite frankly, and geographic areas. Water horses are somewhat the same. We have different names for them in Scandinavia, Norway, Sweden, etc., in Iceland, but they're fairly contiguous beliefs across these cultures. On the other hand, if we're talking about the Puka, who is something that is, in my opinion, much more specific to Ireland, as opposed to like the Bucha in Wales or the Puck beliefs in England, which I think are cousin-related categories but separate. Puka are much more of their own kind of thing, and we would have to have a separate conversation about that. In the same way when we talk about the she, it's a bit of a general term, but there's a lot of room in there to have discussion about exactly what or who would move with populations and what or who wouldn't. I do also think it's important to keep in mind that we really only have so much of this material preserved. Even in oral cultures that are passing down stories, we don't know for certain where these beliefs started, where they originally came from. We can kind of loosely draw some connections, we can theorize, but we don't know for sure. And yes, certainly there is some evidence that there are, Bronze Age and even Neolithic concepts that may have survived in these cultures, particularly through oral storytelling into the modern period. But we don't know for certain, and we have to get very speculative about some of that. Even if that is true, even if these are beliefs that have been passed down for literally thousands of years, that doesn't in and of itself mean that these beings, these folk beliefs, these ideas would be limited to only those places. I think that we really have to have a nuanced conversation about the difference between culture as region, as geography, and culture as community. And I think when we're looking at culture as community, we can't downplay the significance of the connection between what people believe in, the folk beliefs people have, and the beings that they believe in. It makes sense to me that people bring those beliefs and those beings with them when they move, when they go places. So I realize this has been a very wide-ranging conversation in today's video, but I think this is a really important subject. I do admit that I am concerned that I am more and more often running across people who very strongly argue that no, these are tied to specific places and they absolutely cannot move outside of those places. And I think that we need to have this conversation, and people need to be open to every side of this, to the idea that no, certain beings, yes, are tied to a specific place and don't move from that place, just loci, if you will, spirits of place. But we also need to be open to the idea that some of these beings can and do move around and can follow people or communities. And we need to be open to all of these shades of gray, if you will, that are involved in between. And the idea that there is no simple answer, that it really isn't an easy yes or an easy no, that it's complicated. So I'm going to just encourage everyone to give some thought to this. And if you have a strong opinion in one direction or the other, I encourage you to sit down and maybe consider the other side, the other point of view. And also to realize that this, like any kind of folklore, any kind of folk belief, anything to do with fairies is, first of all, complicated. That's rule number one, always complicated. And contradictory. But also that these are things that we really need to be cautious in simplifying. As soon as you simplify it down and give those simple answers, you're losing so many layers to these beliefs and these stories and these beings, and oftentimes in ways that then minimize or reduce who and what these beings are. For myself, as I've mentioned, I personally think if the Ishi want to come to the US or Canada, that they can and they will. I'm not going to tell them they can't. So that's my view on it. And again, like I said, we do have a lot of evidence that the belief that they can and that they do is quite old. That is my bias, that is my opinion. As I said, I am working on a book about this, which I get into all of the specific examples and details. But, I have sat down and given a lot of thought to the people who are the hard line, no, they must be in these specific places. And I see what they're saying. I see the side of their argument. And I think that they are correct, at least in certain instances, in certain ways. I just think we need to be careful not to take one or two examples and generalize that out to the whole, and also to assume that if it's if it's yes here, then it's yes for everything, and if it's no here, then it's no for everything. We really need to take a broader view with all of this and understand that it is very complicated. So, a lot to think about, I hope, a lot to consider, but are the Celtic fairies found outside of traditionally Celtic-speaking cultures? Yes, no, and maybe.